In the year 2000, genetically modified organisms infected Aotearoa, New Zealand, splitting thousands of years of indigenous Maori ancestral genealogy. This tragedy occurred because there were no viable methods for assessing the risks involved with the introduction of genetically modified organisms to indigenous land. This is the story of the Maori people, a story which seeks to shed light on the complexity of indigenous cultures with the intent of making the viewer understand the implications of imposing Western ideas onto non-Western indigenous populations.
Over the last few decades, genetic modification has emerged and advanced throughout the planet. Genetic engineering involves transforming pieces of DNA from one organism into another, with the goal of enhancing or creating a specific trait in an organism. This can range from inserting herbicide resistance genes into agricultural crops to enhancing the growth of animals for consumption. Currently, GMOs are highly contested because of their unknown implications for human health and the environment. Over 50 countries, including the entire European Union, have upheld the precautionary principle and have placed restrictions on the use of GMOs. Other countries, like the United States, are more confident in their use of GMOs and trust risk assessments that are otherwise inconsistent. In addition to the controversial use of GMOs in the Western world, little attention is given to the effects that GMOs have on indigenous communities and culture. The Maori people in Aotearoa, New Zealand faced the introduction of GMOs in the 1970s. In 1998, the New Zealand Pastoral Agricultural Research Institute Limited, now known as AgResearch, sought to field test a genetically modified cow called Bos taurus. The cow would be genetically modified with a human gene to produce milk containing the human myelin basic protein. The cow species would be tested in a special containment facility located on ancestral lands of a Maori subtribe. This caused complications between Maori and AgResearch because the Maori believed that having genetically modified cattle on their land would cause a spiritual imbalance in their community.
Māori's cosmology is based on a web of whakapapa that branches from both people to the natural world and to the spiritual world, and it's a family web where we are genealogically interrelated. And if we start messing with genes at any level, and with any kind of person or plant or animal or substance that's part of that web, then we interfere with the whole web, and we interfere with everybody, from the people to the plants to the soil to our spiritual base as well. So it really, genetic engineering really gets to the very heart of what it means to be Māori and to our whakapapa.
Traditional Maori knowledge encompasses a holistic understanding of nature and its relationship to humans. This knowledge is handed down through Maori generations and can be traced in their concept of whakapapa. Whakapapa functions as a kind of family pedigree in which the lineages connect each generation of the family. Similarly, plant and animal whakapapa allow Maori people to understand their interdependency with ecosystems, leading to a sense of responsibility towards their environmental kinsfolk. Altering the genetic makeup of organisms on their land would disrupt whakapapa. This spiritual imbalance could cause long-term psychological stress on their people, and this could result in physical illness and even death. The Maori call this illness mate Maori. Some Maori people have expressed their concerns as follows.
One of the loudest arguments against biotechnology is coming from our own elders, who are saying very clearly that no one should corrupt or interfere with our whakapapa. The sanctity and respect for whakapapa is to be maintained. Both Maori and the spirit of living things are sacred. The responsibility falls on us to protect the legacy of our future generations, and this includes the guardianship of whakapapa.
Whakapapa and oral translation of knowledge serve important cultural functions, such as making sense of a complex world, imparting moral guidance, and reaffirming deeply held cultural beliefs. For example, Maori ecological knowledge is preserved by Maori women who value their role in protecting biodiversity. How can governments assess the impact that Western science has on indigenous societies? The Environmental Risk Management Authority is responsible for determining whether hazardous substances and new organisms can be introduced into Aotearoa, New Zealand. Despite the strong cultural objections of the Maori people, the Environmental Risk Management Authority approved the AgResearch application in 2000. Out of the 35 members of the committee, 8 have decision-making power, only 2 of which are Maori. The majority of the committee concluded that the scientific and commercial benefits of introducing the cattle outweighed the risks to Maori culture and spirituality. The AgResearch case in New Zealand is an example of broad trends in which environmental decisions are made using a Western worldview. This kind of decision-making deprives indigenous groups of their right to maintain their land and culture. The introduction of GMOs to indigenous land exemplifies the concept of internal colonialism, which thrives on the exploitation of minority groups within a wider society. It is clear, then, that indigenous groups often fall victim to environmental injustices.
Let's dwell on the Maori part with regards to us as Maoris. Because, in the partnership in the Treaty of Waitangi says we are equal. In this instance, they have not given us any indication of their feeling towards us as Maoris and our Maori, M-A-U-R-I. That's very important to us. It's our life force. That's hereditary. That's handed down to us from our genealogy. With this genetic modification, goodness gracious, that's all out the window.
Thus, viable methodologies that uphold procedural justice are needed when Western and indigenous worldviews converge. Procedural justice is the idea of fairness in the process of environmental decision-making. When practicing procedural justice, it is important that the knowledge necessary to inform participation in decision-making is provided in a timely manner. Otherwise, as Tipeni Matua, the former senior policy analyst for Maori in the Environmental Risk Management Authority, explains,
the first few applications to field test GMOs in Aotearoa escaped close scrutiny and requirements for further information on Maori issues, largely because they were the first, and Maori, including myself, were still coming to grips with some of the issues.
This shows how malinformation can lead indigenous people into giving consent to environmental threats. Participatory research methodologies that seek to learn about another culture through the investment of time and ethnographic practices are just one example of a practical step towards knowing the implications of GMO presence on indigenous communities. If we do not seek to understand the implications of Western decisions involving indigenous groups, we will be guilty of cultural genocide.
If you ignore or disregard a people's language and culture, you render them invisible.